Well, hi everybody, Father Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast. I'm the host of the Godcast. I'm also the vicar of St Matthew's Church, and I'm also the author of Our Daily Bread from Argos to the Altar, a Priest Story, which is out now and is available at all good bookshops and online. My guest on the Godcast today is James Esses. Now, James is he is a commentator, he's a writer, he's an advocate who speaks out about the impact of the ideology on society, and is also the co-founder of Thoughtful Therapists. He's got a very interesting story. We're going to learn more about that now, so I do hope you enjoy this Godcast with James Ennis. And if you do, please check out others. There's lots of interviews, lots of people to choose from, and do perhaps consider subscribing to the Godcast. But for now, enjoy this interview. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is James Esses. James, welcome to the Godcast. How are you?
Thanks, Alex. Very good. Thanks for having me on.
So I know your story is quite widely known, but there will be people who are not familiar with it. So if we could start, James, by giving some context to us. You originally were a lawyer. Just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I started off, I qualified and was practicing as a criminal defense barrister. And then I kind of moved into prosecution policy. So I've kind of always had a background in crime and criminal justice. But then I began to volunteer as a counsellor at Childline, which is part of the NSPCC. And, I found the kind of counselling younger people so fulfilling that I thought actually that's what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing. And so that's when I decided to kind of transition out of law and into psychotherapy. And I started on a master's degree in psychotherapy, and then it all kicked off.
Were there things in the job as working in the justice system that was leading you to a vocation change? Were there injustices that you were seeing, or what was it that really prompted the move?
Well, certainly I didn't feel that I was able to make as much of a tangible difference as I had kind of first hoped. I realized that actually I was just a small cog in a very, very big wheel. Whereas again, with the psychotherapy and the counseling, actually being able to work one-to-one with somebody, hopefully see the progress over a period of time, etc. It just felt more personally fulfilling.
And when you began this work with Childline, was there a theme to the phone calls that were coming in? Just share a bit about that if you could, James.
Children and young people would come through for all manner of reasons, and I could go from a contact discussing kind of friendship falling out or kind of bullying in school to domestic abuse in the home to suicidal ideation and self-harm. Quite a broad spectrum in terms of safeguarding and risk, but kind of all manner of presentations.
And alongside this, I guess at university you're studying and learning about all these different processes.
Yes. But
then this issue about gender dysphoria comes along. First of all, James, can I just ask you to explain to people what gender dysphoria is? I know to a lot of people it's like, well, surely but it's a word it's a phrase that's kind of quite new, isn't it, in society?
It is, and some are trying to kind of water it down. But essentially, it's a mental health condition. It's listed under the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is essentially the kind of manual of mental health conditions and disorders that is used by psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists. It's what we use in the United Kingdom. And gender dysphoria in essence kind of describes a kind of very debilitating sensation, feeling that there's a kind of mismatch between your sex and the concept of how you feel inside. You have to be diagnosed with it to transition medically or legally in this country, and that's crucial. And that's kind of the starting point for me in terms of how you deal with somebody who's feeling this mismatch, who's not feeling at ease in their body.
And what was What was being taught to you at the university about this subject?
Um, the very very little, and psychotherapy training is lacking in a lot of ways generally, in terms of the contact hours, in terms of how it's assessed. But essentially, I was being taught that everyone's got a unique gender identity, and we shouldn't be pathologizing this. Um, and essentially, if you push back against that, this could be transphobia, um, which was concerning to me because it's a mental health condition, and as psychotherapists, we're going to have clients coming through with these presentations, and so it's important for us to be able to at least have a dialogue amongst each other as to what we believe is in the best interests of these clients, and kind of try and work collaboratively. Of course, people will have different opinions. That's fine. It can be a broad church. But in terms of what ended up happening to me and what I've seen happen to other professionals and colleagues, they're just shutting down the conversation altogether.
We'll come on to that in a minute. And
Yeah.
in terms of the charity work, actually working with, I think you said it was Childline, James.
Yeah.
Was there advice given to you how you should, or training or coaching, how you should respond to these phone calls as and when they came in?
At the beginning, no, but then I started to notice things kind of changing around me. I would come in for my shift and I would see that there were posters from Stonewall plastered on the wall right where I was looking when I'm literally on the phone to these children saying, some people are trans, get over it. And I started to think, okay, what are they trying to suggest here to counsellors? I noticed that people weren't really comfortable in kind of bringing up these kind of topics of conversation. We had kind of diversity, inclusion training as part of that role. Again, pushing a narrative around gender identity. Childline's website, because often we would refer children onto parts of Childline's website. There's a page on gender identity. It didn't tell children that this is a mental health condition and that most children will essentially grow out of it and settle into their bodies. It was more of a roadmap towards different ways they might want to transition. So I was becoming increasingly concerned with the kind of narrative that the NSPCC and Childline were pushing.
And how would that present itself, James, in the context of a telephone call? Was it mainly boys or girls? Was it teenagers particularly, or was it children younger than that? Could you say a little bit about that?
In terms of the contacts I had on this topic, majority were girls, majority were young girls. I think the youngest I would have spoken to who said they felt they were trapped in the wrong body was around the age of 8 or 9 years old, so kind of pre-pubescent. But I was there for about 5-6 years, and year on year, I was noticing an increase in the number of children coming through with this presentation.
And why do you think that was? Was it a trend, or in your mind, or?
I believe that there's a number of contributing factors. I think there's an element of contagion in relation to this as a kind of mental health presentation. I believe it's partly down to what is being taught in schools, and what children are kind of picking up on as well. And outside of school, from the media, as it then was, from social media, from third sector organizations, and even through kind of corporations, kind of pushing a particular narrative. So I think children are absorbing this, as we know children do, and also it kind of makes sense because most of us are unhappy with parts of our body or parts of ourselves. I think that's kind of part of the human condition in many ways, and particularly children going through puberty and all those changes going on. And now there's kind of a silver bullet being promised, essentially, which is, well, if you don't like a part of your body, you can just get rid of it now. And I think that could be quite appealing to a child who's feeling very insecure in themselves.
Was it difficult to, I would use the word pastor, you might use the word counsel or whatever, but was it difficult to advise and help those individuals? When you were suggesting something or proposing something, was there much resistance, or were they empathetic to what you were saying?
Well, the thing is that, the model used at Childline and the model that I use generally, and when I was kind of practicing in psychotherapy, is around exploration. I've never viewed it as my role and it isn't the role of a therapist to tell clients what to do, to try and push them in a direction. Um, I would simply explore, which was contrary, and that's what you're meant to do, and that's contrary to what some of my colleagues would do, which is the opposite of exploration. So I would read case notes from other counsellors who had spoken to children who would come in. A child says they're trans, and the counsellor would essentially affirm it, which means nodding along with this. If the child said they wanted to go and take puberty blockers, the counsellor would kind of nod along with that, so keep affirming them down that path. That's to me not ethical counselling. That's not exploration. So if a child came through to me and said they thought they were trapped in the wrong body, I would ask open-ended questions about how long they felt like this, what else has been going on in their life, what other parts of themselves they don't like, what options they think they've got generally. I would often do kind of thought experiments. I would say, okay, let's imagine years down the line, 5 years from now, you've taken the puberty blockers, the cross-sex hormones, maybe you've even had surgery. Are you happy? And more often than not, and that's not a leading question, that's just exploration. More often than not, they'd come back and say, well, no, because there's still X, Y, Z I dislike about myself. And slowly, they'd come to realize that actually this wasn't maybe the solution that they thought it was, and that maybe this was symptomatic of kind of wider disease in themselves.
And what prompted you to go public, James? What was the things that kind of were getting you so frustrated or determined to speak out about this? What was it?
The catalyst for kind of really going public with it was when the government announced at the time this ban on conversion therapy, because I was already experiencing kind of a shutdown of conversation and dialogue within the therapeutic profession, and there was a real concern that this legislation would make things even worse and might almost force therapists, for fear of criminalization, into affirming clients rather than exploring. So that was kind of the catalyst that really kind of made me put myself out there. But I've been increasingly concerned over a period of a few years, and was just trying to kind of get my head straight in terms of where I sat with this and what I thought was kind of the best way to address it.
And then the university picked up on the fact that you'd gone public. Is that what happened? Can you just talk us through that part of the story, James?
Yeah, so I I drew up a petition to the government asking them to safeguard explorative therapy as part of any legislation. And the petition did quite well, and it got 10,000 signatures and a response from the government. And I did some associated publicity around that, started putting some things out on social media. And yeah, one day out of the blue in May 2021, I was told that there had been some complaints made about me. I was asked to come in for an informal chat to discuss it. They didn't share with me the nature of the complaints. They just said it had been in relation to kind of the trans things that I've been talking about. I agreed to come in for the chat, but the chat never happened because the very next day I received another email telling me that actually I was being summarily expelled from the course because I had supposedly brought the profession into disrepute. And that was it. Over a single email, I was effectively excommunicated.
So what did you do then?
I cried. Um, I I felt completely lost.
Did you know that saying what you'd said would be controversial? Did you think it was quite reasonable and well thought rationale behind the argument? Were you surprised that the university wasn't encouraging that?
Yes, because it's expressly written into their policies. There's a part of their policy which makes a point of saying that students and tutors might disagree with things, but what's important is that you're able to have open, respectful dialogue about matters. So it seemed I was shocked then, and I still remain shocked now as to how they thought that this was a reasonable measure to take against a master's student in the third year. I just, of all the vocations for this kind of shutdown of dialogue to take place in, I mean, the fundamental basis of psychotherapy is active listening. I mean, it's kind of crazy to me. And also, not one jot of consideration given to the impact that the way they dealt with this might have on my own well-being. And any kind of pastoral care seemed to go completely out the window.
Did you do you think they thought you would go away quietly? Were they, were they what was the response when you kind of said, well, I'll take you to court?
Well, I've never actually had a conversation with anyone there since this
Right.
happened. Well, actually, that's a lie. I have had students and tutors anonymously contacting me saying that they also share my concerns, but are too afraid to speak out, which is interesting. But in terms of the kind of the upper echelons of the institution, I've not had a conversation with anyone. They seem to want to kind of fight this all the way. Did they think I would go away quietly? I don't know. I don't think they did much thinking at all, to be honest. But I think I believe that this institution, as many others, have kind of bought this ideology hook, line, and sinker, kind of fervently believe it, and anything that challenges the narrative they believe in, they just want to shut down. And so the case I'm bringing is on discrimination against my beliefs, and that's precisely why I believe they did what they did. And had I been publicly speaking about some other issue, I don't know, anti-Semitism in society, or I don't know, yeah, even more polarized things like what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, I would still be, well, I would have qualified from that course. I wouldn't have been kicked out. It was because of this topic and because of my beliefs.
And I can hear the audience wondering, well, where is he in the legal process? Where are you, James, in that legal process?
Well, I also took litigation against one of the kind of main governing bodies of therapists. They're called the UK Council for Psychotherapy. I recently reached a settlement with them, and they put out what I think is a very important kind of groundbreaking statement, which basically says that the beliefs that I held are kind of valid professional beliefs within the therapeutic profession, and are protected under law. So that was quite important. So I've kind of dealt with them. But in terms of getting to trial with the institution, it's a very, very slow process. And essentially we're waiting for trial dates. And I think hopefully by the end of April, we'll have trial dates listed. I mean, we might not get on to trial until 2025, which will have been about 3.5 years after I was expelled, which is again kind of crazy. But that's the justice system, and I have to work within it.
What have been the consequences? I mean, the pluses, maybe, and the minuses, James, of that happening for you. I mean, I suppose as one door closes, another one opens, and whilst you've not been able to continue the course, you now speak, as we are, on a public platform. What would you say about
that? I've met some very decent, inspirational people through this, which I'm grateful for. I've seen some of the best of human beings, including in the support that I've received, and even the kind of financial backing, because I wouldn't have been able to bring my case without crowdfunding. So I've seen a huge amount of kind of empathy and generosity. I've also seen the worst of people. I mean, the type of abuse I guess online, death wishes, forever being called transphobe, bigot, conversion therapist, people trying to kind of find personal details, trying to find my home address so they can post it online, trying to hack into various accounts I've got, essentially trying to kind of screw up my life as much as possible. And I think now people Google my name, they see what I'm associated with, and if they don't agree with my beliefs, that gives them a reason and an opportunity to essentially close the door on certain opportunities. So I think it certainly made my life a lot more complicated than it otherwise might have been. But for me, I can sleep soundly at night because I feel that I've been true to myself and my principles. And so for me, that will always be the most important thing, even if I've kind of personally suffered for it.
Yeah, and can we just unpack that a bit about transphobia, James? I mean, I would guess you would say you're not transphobic. You're just calling for better care and consideration of how people are educated. Is that fair? I mean, I've got a couple of people I know who are trans, older people, who speak very eloquently about their own story and their own journey, but from a different generation. These are people who went through the process probably in the 70s or 80s. So let's be clear: are you saying you're not transphobic?
Depends what the definition of transphobic is, and the modern definition seems to be anyone who speaks out against any form of gender ideology, questions men entering women's spaces, question children being put on puberty blockers. If that is the modern definition of transphobia, and I think it might be in a lot of circles, then yes, I am transphobic. But if it's based around having a hatred or a fear of or a disdain for or trying to discriminate against people because of how they feel inside, then no, I'm not. I'm a concerned citizen, particularly concerned about what we're doing to our children.
Yeah, I mean, I've chatted since I knew you were coming on the Godcast, James. I've chatted with other clergy about this. I mean, it's a matter of morality, ethics, whichever way you want to frame it. And in the church, we've had there's a raging row about the term conversion therapy. There's the way it's used in the way to kind of used against people who may be gay, of turning away from something in terms of a spiritual matter. But your context is different, is it?
Well, I've worked with a number of Christian organizations including on the conversion therapy ban, because there's kind of the similar concerns there. And I'm not coming at it myself from a perspective of religion, but I can see the arguments coming from a lot of these Christian organizations, because there's a real risk that this legislation will, effectively criminalize conversations, even kind of pastoral conversations. And I can't get my head around that, because I can't understand how we can have a society in which a child can consent to irreversible puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, that they can consent to that, but they cannot consent to a conversation with a priest or with a therapist. It doesn't make sense to me.
Do you differentiate between trans and LGBT?
Yeah, completely. And again, this prospective legislation conflates the two of those things, because as I said, I don't recognize the concept of gender identity. And because you need to be diagnosed with a mental health condition in order to transition in this country, then I'm not even going to use the term gender identity. I'm going to use the term gender dysphoria. And so to conflate that with one's sexuality, I don't think is acceptable. And I've seen a lot of forced teaming going on. I see these placards being held up at pride marches, etc. No LGB without the T. Well, who the hell are you to make that comment? I know a lot of LGB people who completely reject that notion. So I think the development of that acronym has been one of the biggest issues, because now it's what everyone uses and it rolls off the tongue so easily. I wrote a piece about this recently. I said, if you were in a bar looking at a spirits or a drinks list and you see G and asterisk, you're going to add in the T because it's so familiar to you. And it's the same thing here. And people use it without even thinking about the kind of consequences of it.
I spoke to Helen Joyce, James, on similar subjects, and she was very critical of Stonewall, because she effectively said, that we wouldn't have these issues if it wasn't for groups like Stonewall, because they almost won the lesbian and gay argument, and this is a further way to kind of extenuate these issues. Do you agree with that?
I think they've got a lot to answer for. I mean, I'm not going to lay the blame, solely at their door, but yeah, they've got a lot to answer for. And again, it was from them, I've done research into it. It was a very calculated, strategic move, because sex-based rights, kind of same-sex attraction society had essentially been transformed, was far better than it was. We saw kind of parity and equality across the law, and Stonewall began to lose its relevance. And people were rightly asking, well, what is the purpose of Stonewall? Do they really need to continue anymore? Have they served their purpose? And then all of a sudden, there's a new leader in Stonewall, and they've got a brand new policy, which is for the first time ever to become trans inclusive. There was a point in time in which they made a specific statement saying that they weren't going to be trans inclusive because they felt that those aims were actually counter to trying to, put forward the best possible campaigning for LGB people. But all of a sudden, overnight, they've got a new policy, a new agenda, new long-term strategy, and that's it. They've kind of been able to turn their hand to something else and keep making money as a result and stay relevant. So I think it was wholly strategic on their part, and I think that did kind of. I think that did change society beyond recognition because it was through their work that they've been able to kind of, in my view, infiltrate various organizations, having these employer schemes where employers are desperate to kind of gain favor with them. Because once these things are embedded in workplace policies, etc., and normalizing it, I think that it's very difficult to kind of come back from that. So yes, I think Stonewall have done a lot of damage. Thankfully, their influence is dwindling, but they're still very powerful and have a lot of clout.
Yeah, and somebody like myself, James, who's probably described as a woolly liberal, who affirms part of an inclusive church. Who, my position, I want to welcome everybody. I'm just the kind of person that feels that if you believe something, that's fine. If you believe something else, that's fine. And so when I say inclusive, I don't just mean gay people are welcome through the door. I mean people on the opposite side who may have a very extreme conservative position. What would you say to somebody that it's like just live and let live? Do you think society needs to give people guidance about things, matters of sexuality or not, or is that for them?
On sexuality?
Well, the whole range. I mean, whether you come out as gay, everybody seems to have an opinion, don't they? Certainly in the church,
Yeah.
they do anyway. And particularly on this matter of gender dysphoria, I think a lot of people, and I'll include myself in this, I mean, I'll probably get some pelters afterwards, but for maybe not being educated enough. But I'm a 55-year-old guy that didn't really have these things to consider and think about, and it's only in more recent times that they become something for me to consider. And I'm really careful I don't say the wrong thing or put my foot in it. I need guidance, I think, and I'm just wondering whether you think that's something that we all need as a society.
Well, I think what you've just said is quite interesting, because historically, I think that the church and also kind of other bodies representing other religions were not so afraid of putting their foot in it because they have their beliefs. And even if those beliefs to some are distasteful or considered a bit, out of touch with the modern era, that's the fundamental basis of the religion. And so they would kind of be proud about saying it. Whereas what I'm hearing more and more is similar to what you said, which is people coming from a religious perspective walking on eggshells, almost to the point that I feel that a lot of the fundamental basics of these religions are essentially being kind of thrown to one side. It seems increasingly as if the church is kind of propping up this belief that yes, you could be trapped in the wrong body, and that it's possible to change sex. I mean, I'm not Christian. I don't believe there's any basis whatsoever to kind of put out that statement or something like that. So I'm a bit confused as to what's going on in the church. I mean, just yesterday, I was driving home and there's a billboard advertising a new church that's opened up. And again, they're calling themselves a kind of inclusive church. And this, like, I don't know, priest, vicar with a pride flag around their neck. I just don't really know what's going on. But in terms of welcoming your doors to everyone, regardless of view, belief, whatever, yeah, sure. Like, of course, we shouldn't be discriminating against people because of their beliefs. I fundamentally believe in freedom of speech, but I find it interesting when religions seem to almost be going along with this agenda to avoid coming in for criticism, even if it flies in the face of some of their kind of fundamental teachings.
Yeah, that's very interesting what you've said. I mean, it would lend itself very well to a more conservative theology in the church, you know, and certainly in other faiths, Islam and Judaism, you know, these kind of conversations I would imagine would be kind of thrown out. You know, the idea of changing sex would just be a complete no-no, and is a complete no-no for many uh, people that I know within the Church of England. I think maybe I can't speak for other people, but I didn't go to church for a long time, so I came from a world where I grew up in a secular world, working in a plug my book, Argos to the altar. I worked for Argos for 20 years, so I worked in the real world. So I was party to all sorts of people and experiences. James, just to finish off, can I ask how you think we should then perhaps deal with matters of gender dysphoria? What would be your proposal for a way forward and how we deal with these matters?
Well, I think in terms of gender dysphoria, I think we need to go back to basics with this. And I think we need to come to understand as a society that this is a mental health condition and presentation, and so should be dealt with accordingly through explorative therapy, or simply through what the term, watchful waiting that's often been used in relation to children. Because as I said, most children who feel this disconnect will kind of grow out of it, essentially. I think we need to put a complete block, for use of a better word, on children taking puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and being put on waiting lists for double mastectomies, etc. For me, that's the single most important thing that we have to do here. There's so much else in the world of sex-based rights around women's spaces, around women's sport, around free speech. But for me, we have to look after the children first and foremost, because that's kind of really the key job of any society, and to make sure children are safe. So, we're waiting for the final review from Dr. Hilary Cass, who's doing a review into the kind of gender identity services in the country. So it'll be very interesting to see what she comes out with. There's an NHS ongoing consultation again around treatment for gender dysphoria. I'm hoping that they block all of this, but I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen if there's a new government in a few months' time. The Labour Party have kind of said they want to support gender affirming care. They want to support ban on conversion therapy. One time they were pushing for self-ID. So I don't really know. Could be quite an interesting few months.
Yeah, I think so. James, I've really enjoyed talking to you. I think we probably don't hold all the same opinions, but I really do support the need for free speech, and I think conversations is the way to get through these things, isn't it? I mean, I get a few pelters online just for being a priest, and so I'm sympathetic to the abuse that you've described. But yeah, thanks, James. I've really enjoyed your conversation. I'm sure there'll be some reflections from other people once they've watched this. But for now, thank you for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Nice chatting.